So this week we're continuing our series on Bible 101, Bible questions, which will kind of run through the gamut of everything you've ever wanted to know about the Bible. Last week we talked about who wrote the Bible, the Old Testament. So this week we're going to talk about who wrote the New Testament. Now on one level it's actually easier because you have a lot more names attached to books, and sometimes they even sign their names. So you think this will be really easy, but it's not. In some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's even more complicated, which makes it more fun. So the clearest specification of New Testament authorship is associated with Paul's letters, which kind of matches the format of letters as they were written back then. They almost always begin with, here's who's writing it, here's who it's to, which makes it really easy. You can look at other letters from that time, it'll be the same. So a lot of Paul's letters come between 50 and 60 CE or AD. They're actually the earliest of the books in the New Testament. So the things we have closest to the life of Jesus are actually some of those letters from Paul. The Gospels were written afterwards, sometimes much later. The earliest Gospel was probably somewhere after 70 AD. So the closest thing we get to how people were thinking about Jesus and the church is those letters from Paul. Now, it seems to be clear, okay, Paul signs his name, he writes these letters. Well, yes and no. Pauline authorship seems clear in the case of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon in probable chronological order. But it's common to conclude that the salutation is just kind of a pseudonymous. I always hate that word, pseudonymous. How do you pronounce that word? Yeah, I don't know. I always just don't say it right. It's a weird word. I need a better word in some cases, because what typically would happen is somebody who is the student of somebody else would sign their name, and they didn't think anything wrong with that at all. That was kind of honoring that person, kind of like with the Old Testament. You know, when we talked about 1st, 2nd, 3rd Isaiah, they took the prophet's name because that was they were writing in that tradition, in that style. It's the same thing with Paul's letters. They're not trying to be sneaky. It's, we are Paul's students. We are honoring our teacher by continuing to write in his name with his thoughts. So some of those books, a lot of scholars don't believe Paul wrote them. And you can kind of see the list here. Mostly the so-called pastoral epistles like 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, sometimes Ephesians and Colossians. And then we have no idea who wrote the book of Hebrews. There's no name attached to it, no evidence whatsoever. It's just kind of an anonymous author. So then you have the letters of Peter, James, and John. So we don't know who wrote those. They have names on them, but it's not commonly thought that the Apostle Peter wrote those because they're writing at such a time and referencing things more of a church already kind of existing that would have been past the time Peter was alive, if that makes sense. So based on the content, the issues, that's why they don't think Peter wrote those, because it wouldn't match up with his timeline. Does that make sense? But again, you write kind of in that person's name because one of the kind of cultural hallmarks is back then, Hellenistic period, older is better. So if you can kind of trace and say, hey, this established person wrote this, you get much more oomph than someone else. It's like movies sometimes when they want to put starring whoever that people know and they only have like 3 lines in the movie, but they put them on the front. People think, oh, it must be a good movie because this person did. Or executive produced by someone famous who made a lot of other good movies. Now, when you executive produce, you don't actually do anything, but people think you do, so they're using that name because that name carries weight and power. So if you want your message to really get out there, you take on another name. Now, with the Gospels, we talked a little bit about this last week. So we have 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They have names. Traditionally, we've kind of said Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark, all that good stuff. Mark was probably the first Gospel written. In around sometime after 70 AD. The reason we date it that way is because the way he references the destruction of the temple seems to suggest he's writing for his Jewish audience sometime after the temple was destroyed and sacked when the Romans put down one of the Roman revolts, one of the Jewish revolts that was happening around 70 AD. So we think it was sometime soon after that. And I think Mark probably wrote it. Now, Matthew and Luke use a whole lot of Mark. A good half of their Gospels are word for word from Mark. So they're clearly looking at it, writing it down, and just copying it over. But they add stuff. So why reinvent the wheel? We have something already, it's pretty good, but we want to add to it. We want to add our own flair, and we have our own audience. Have you ever noticed how politicians change what they say depending on who's listening to them? People talk about one thing in California, they'll talk about a different in West Virginia. You'll talk about Social Security a lot in Florida, maybe not so much in New York City. Because your audience matters. You want to address things to them that are important to them. So both Matthew and Luke are writing to different audiences. Matthew is writing to probably a more Jewish, Northern Israel audience. That's why he's constantly bringing in things like, this was done according to the scripture, and insert Old Testament scripture. He didn't really care that none of those scriptures he inputted were actually prophecies. He just wanted to tie more of the Jesus story to traditional Jewish scriptures. He does that constantly. He's writing to a Jewish audience. Luke is writing to a more Gentile audience. So he tells things a little differently. So it makes sense to have some differences. So they use a whole lot of Mark. Then they use another source that we call the Q source. We call it the Q source because in the German word for source starts with Q, and no one wants to have to say that weird German name, so we just go with Q. It's a whole lot easier for everybody. Q is probably an oral tradition. There's never been a document found that's just that Q part of the gospel. So you have, in Matthew and Luke, you have a lot of things copied right from Mark. Then you have things that are exactly the same between each other, but aren't in Mark. That's Q. Then they have some things that are just for them unique to Matthew and Luke. And that's the minority part of each gospel. And there are little differences in timelines and things like that. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, they're called the synoptic gospels because they have a lot in common. Then you have John, who's got his own little thing going on there. John might have been writing from like an Essene community, something like that. He kind of goes off on his own. So a lot of all those I am statements only in John. There are some stories only in John, like the woman at the well, those kind of things. He changed the date of when Jesus was actually crucified, little things like that, because he has his own, again, audience, his own theological story he's telling, so he plays with dates to better fit symbolism. And again, as we said 2 weeks ago, the Bible's not meant to be a history book. They're not actually trying to write an accurate history. They're writing more of a theological story, so they play with details to make more theological sense. So you have John, the Gospel, then you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the letters, and the book of Revelation. Traditionally, they all kind of were put under John's authorship. But scholarship thinks one person didn't write them all, again, because of the long period of time. The Gospel of John was probably written anywhere from like 100 AD to like 215 AD. That's a big spread. It was probably the last Gospel written somewhere around the Turkey, Asia Minor area. Then you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. Now, Revelation is a book. We should do a whole study on it, but it's not about the future. It's not prophesying the end of the world. It's actually about what was happening with the Roman Empire at that time. They write in code and symbol about a future to better talk about now without getting in trouble. That's common in the Bible. So the book of Daniel was written about the past, but actually about the current, when the Seleucids had overtaken Jerusalem, and you had the desolation, sacrilege of desolation of the temple, and all that. So they were writing about the bad guys taking over them now by writing the past, but really it's, these are the bad guys here. Sometimes we tell stories about the past to point a lens at our present, or even the future to point a lens at our present. It's easier sometimes to sneak things in that way. Now, Revelation, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the Gospel of John have a lot in common. There's all these different ways of writing, symbolisms of light and dark, names for Jesus that are unique to John. So that's why people put them together. But it's really more of a school of thought. Years ago, I was horribly disappointed when I discovered a shocking truth. There is no such person as Franklin W. Dixon, the author of the Hardy Boys books. For years, I thought there was a guy named Franklin W. Dixon who wrote these books. There's not. It's a room of authors who take on that name so they can churn out the books more. So they use the same characters, they follow the same basic storylines, they have the same kind of symbolisms and things, but it's a bunch of different people writing under one name. Same thing with the Nancy Drew books. I forgot that person. No such person. Yeah. No such person. And you know what? There's no such person as Monty Python either. So similarly, these writers are taking kind of the name of John in that same school of thought, same philosophy, same message, but they're writing over the course of sometimes multiple generations. It wasn't seen to be bad or hiding. It's like we are honoring this person. They're the originator of this, so we're keeping their name at the top. So that's kind of New Testament in a nutshell. A lot of it's the Paul stuff, a few other epistles, not sure who wrote them. And then you had that school of thought in John and the Gospels. Questions, comments, snide remarks? Yes, Bob.
Was John ever on the Isle of Patmos?
Hard to say. Somebody was probably on the Isle of Patmos. His name might have been John. It might not have been the same disciple of John because the dates just don't quite add up. But this is one of the things you never know.
He's there.
Yeah. So it could be somebody's there writing, or they might just be choosing a location to kind of say, hey, this is where I'm at. We don't know. There's no other historical evidence that says this has happened. We don't have a little chisel. I am John. I am here on this island. Here's the date or anything. So a lot of things we just don't know. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter where he was when he's writing. This is whoever's writing it in that vein. The key is what message were they trying to get across to the Christians living in a difficult time with the Roman Empire kind of doing their whole thing. So we'll talk more about Revelation on a future study as we go through all these questions about the Bible. Any other questions? I will see you next week for another question more on how the Bible came to be in this first focus of lessons.